From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Republican politicians eyeing the 2024 election converge on Las Vegas as President Biden quietly turns 80 years old. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues on the editorial board, Monet Ukwe-Barua and Colin Levy. If President Trump hoped that his early announcement of a 2024 campaign would clear the field of potential Republican rivals, the early signs suggest that it isn't working out that way. Over the weekend, several prominent Republicans were in Las Vegas for the Republican Jewish Coalition Conference. And one thing that they seemed to agree on was that President Trump isn't an inevitability for a second shot as the GOP nominee in 2024. Let's start with a couple clips. First, this is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and then former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley.
There is no substitute for victory. We in Florida are the light. Freedom will reign supreme with Florida leading the way. I want to thank each and every one of you for your support. We've accomplished more over a 4-year period than anybody thought possible. But I can tell you this, we've got a lot more to do, and I have only begun to fight. Thank you all. God bless you. Thanks so much.
A lot of people have asked if I'm going to run for president. Now that the midterms are over, I'll look at it in a serious way, and I'll have more to say soon. If my family and I decide to continue our life of service, we will put 1,000% into it, and we'll finish it. For now, I'll say this. I've won tough primaries and tough general elections. I've been the underdog every single time. When people underestimate me, it's always fun. But I've never lost an election, and I'm not going to start now.
Monet, what's particularly notable about that latter clip is that here's what Nikki Haley said in April of 2021, quote, "I would not run if President Trump ran," unquote. So it's fascinating. I'm curious what your take is here on what has changed in the Republican thinking.
Yeah, I think what has changed has been the outcome of the midterm elections just a few weeks ago. President Trump was front and center in that process, handpicking nominees for a lot of these races, and those nominees ended up underperforming greatly. And you saw a reckoning throughout the entire Republican Party about Trump's role. And the polls, just in that short amount of time since the midterms, have reflected that. This isn't just something that the Republican Party powers that be and donors have noticed. Even the electorate has started to cool a little bit on Trump. And you've seen DeSantis is now leading him in most head-to-head polls in some of these early primary states. And so I think a lot of the contenders, DeSantis, Haley, Pompeo, have looked at that result and said, we really do potentially have a shot at getting a nomination over Donald Trump, which they probably would have thought was unlikely even a few short weeks ago. But frankly, I think it's important to note that the purpose of an event like the Republican Jewish Coalition in Las Vegas is to show off the potential candidates to donors, people who are just gauging the field for the first time and considering who they might throw their support behind. And so I do think that it's probably kind of shaping up to see whether all of the money is going to fall behind DeSantis or whether some of these other candidates are able to make enough of a contrast and enough of a case for themselves to attract donor attention. So that's really what listeners should be watching for over the next few weeks.
But the change in tone, I think, is remarkable. And we have a couple other clips here. Let's first do former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and then current New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu.
This loyalty, this work that we must do together is not to a person. This loyalty that I executed alongside Vice President Pence for 4 years was to our nation. It was to a common cause. I was loyal. I worked hard. I did every day everything that I could to honor and be loyal to the oath that I took when I raised my right hand to defend the country. It wasn't a loyalty to a person or a party or a faction. It was to you and the promises that we had made to the United States of America.
I got a great policy for the Republican Party. Let's stop supporting crazy, unelectable candidates in our primaries and start getting behind winners that can close the deal in November. There's a unique decision for you. I mean, really, holy cow. That's important. Don't just assume it's all going to work out.
Colin, I think that Monet is right that what has changed here is the results of the midterm elections and the disappointing vote totals posted by some of President Trump's endorsed candidates. But I do think it is notable that it seems sort of like a dam has broken, and neither of those people we just played, Mike Pompeo or Chris Sununu, neither of them said the word Donald Trump. But it was pretty pointed in their criticisms.
It sure was. I actually really enjoyed listening to these speeches. I think that the message coming out of here is that, the primary is going to be big and it's going to be raucous. And the level of deference that you've seen to Donald Trump in the past is effectively over. Now, that doesn't mean that he's not going to be a force, but it certainly means that the tone is changing. And I hesitate to call it bravery because it's not bravery now that they're sort of, seeing a chink in his armor. But at the same time, it's a shift. And one thing that I really liked in listening to these speeches is that I think there was an explicit move away from the cult of personality and celebrity and a real acknowledgement that that's been something that hasn't worked for the party, that it may have been something that worked for Trump on a one-off. He is a one-off sort of a person, but that was a failure in the midterms. And there was an explicit acknowledgement that we sort of a need to move back to issues. And so when you look at the way that each of these candidates is going to address GOP voters, I think you're going to see them trying to embrace many of the issues that the base likes, but without really giving Trump much ownership of those. So I think that's going to be a difference.
But the shift in how people are talking about this is huge. I mean, a month ago, the assumption was that President Trump was going to run for president in 2024, and he was going to be such a strong candidate with such a grip on the Republican Party that the question was whether any of these prominent people would challenge him at all, whether Ron DeSantis would think it worth his effort in 2024 or whether he would decide that he would be better off biding his time until 2028. And now it seems like we may have a field full of people, debate stage. Remember in 2016, there were so many presidential candidates that they had to split the debate into an undercard debate and then a main stage debate. And it raises the question of whether we may see what we saw in 2016, which was another coordination problem, because the assumption was that on all these candidates' part was that Trump would flame out at some point and the last man standing would be there to pick up the pieces. And so there was a pileup of Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio and John Kasich attacking each other and not really attacking President Trump and not wanting to drop out until they had their moment in the sun. John Kasich specifically waiting until he had the chance to win the Ohio primary, which he in fact did. And the result of that was that President Trump had about a third of the party, and the rest of these candidates were splitting the rest of it. So President Trump won some of these primaries. I went back and checked the numbers again. South Carolina, New Hampshire, Arkansas, Vermont primaries with 33% of the vote, won the Virginia primary with 35%, won Michigan with 36%, won Georgia and Tennessee with 39%. And it does seem to me, Monet, that President Trump still has a really sizable core of supporters. Does it suggest that we may end up with a similar problem in 2024, or a similar challenge, at least, for people who don't want President Trump as the nominee again, where he is banking on that core of support, and there are 5 candidates behind him that are chopping up the rest of the vote?
Yes, that is a very real and potent possibility, that you're going to have too much of a divided field. In fact, it could actually be counterproductive that Trump now seems so vulnerable, because it could be tempting a lot of candidates who otherwise would not have run to say, hey, maybe I do have a shot at this thing. So if that has the consequence of expanding the field, it could backfire and empower Trump in exactly the way that you just mentioned. I think one of the things to watch is that Trump is a vacuum for small dollar donations. Most of the ordinary Fox News viewers, kind of Republican, just sort of individuals who are donating to campaigns, give to Donald Trump. He raised by far the most small dollar donations of any candidate. And so that means that the ability to mount an alternative campaign is going to depend on locking down big donors to potentially fund it. You've seen DeSantis already take a big lead in that respect. Ken Griffin, who is the founder of Citadel, who famously moved his headquarters from Chicago to Miami, was the first to get on board and explicitly say, not only am I supporting DeSantis, but I would support him against Trump in a primary. And you recently saw Steve Schwartzman, who was another supporter of Trump's while he was in the White House, say that he's disavowing Trump and looking for an alternative. And so I think that that's going to be the next few weeks before the early part of next year when candidates actually begin to announce. You're going to see a lot of people who are imagining running think they could be contenders, seeing how much serious support can I actually lock in here. And hopefully the donors are disciplined enough that they're not funding a dozen different competing campaigns, that they're doing some of the coordination work and making sure there will only be a few competitors to Trump actually on the debate stage by the time primary season actually starts.
Republicans did learn their lesson from what happened last time. And I think that we're still in the early days. And, should the party make an effort to coalesce around a candidate, I think there's definitely going to be a push for that when the time comes. But, right now, I think we're in a period where there's a lot of sorting to do in terms of the party's direction. And, I would even say it's an important moment for the Republican Party to try to rediscover what its core message is and, what its authentic policy voice is in the aftermath of this Trump period. And I think having a lot of candidates in there right now isn't a handicap. I actually think it's going to be sort of a healthy moment for democracy. And, for sure, when the time comes for things to be narrowed down, Sununu actually already came out and said, as governor of New Hampshire, which has the first primary, he'd make sure that there weren't too many stragglers hanging around there. And the role of the party committees presumably will maybe be a bit stronger when they were in the pre-Trump era. So, I think there will be time for that. But for the moment, I think it's good to just enjoy hearing these new voices and the sense that there is a fresh generation that's actually willing to step up now.
But let me pick up on your phrase, fresh generation there, Colin, because that's another piece I wanted to pull out from Nikki Haley's speech. She said it's time to call for, quote, a younger generation to lead across the board, unquote. And it seems like this is maybe the beginnings of making age an issue in 2024. And Republicans have made a lot of hay of President Biden's rhetorical stumbles. He turned 80 on Sunday. But don't forget that President Trump is 76 now. He would be 78 in 2024. And maybe this is the beginning of the argument that if we're going to try to beat President Biden, Colin, we're better off trying to do that with a candidate who is a contrast and not a guy who's just a couple years younger.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. I think there's a lot of that sense in both parties, quite frankly, the Republicans and the Democrats, looking at these two old guys and thinking, what's next? It's time to move on from that. You have to remember, many people who work in the private workforce know that companies often expect their high-level executives to retire at age 65. It used to be a requirement. When Congress first passed the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, it only protected people up to age 65. And they later changed that to allow for occupational safety and things like police and fire, and also for workers who are in high-level bona fide executive or policymaking positions. And you look at these, President Biden is a bit more of an egregious example because of the stories that people note about his gaffes. President Trump just makes gaffes part of his central personality, so nobody really puts that on account of his age. They think that's just Trump being Trump. But these are real issues. And for all of the ways that these candidates are able to sort of keep themselves going, they're just like athletes. At the end of the day, there are all the things you can do to preserve yourself, to be at the top of your game. These are, obviously people at the top of their game, but there's also the turning of the earth. And at some point, you just can't compete in the brain cell department with someone who's 35 or 40 years old.